We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Beis Meseches Shevuos. This is Shevuos Daf 37b. On the previous Amud, Rabbah said that if you have a kfiras mammon, somebody denies a monetary obligation, but there are witnesses that know that there is such a monetary obligation. So in that case, Rabbah says Potter, the person is exempt in terms of Shevuos HaPikadon because his denial, again, it's a false denial, but his denial is not considered to be substantial since there are witnesses anyhow that are able to testify that the person is actually obligated. And on the previous Amud, the Gemara was bringing a proof from a Mishnah that had to do with Shevuos HaEdos. It's a Mishnah we had earlier. The Mishnah was talking about a situation where you have two sets of witnesses. Each set of witnesses deny that they know testimony in a certain case, and so the Mishnah said they're both liable in terms of Shevuos HaEdos. And so the Gemara says, one second, when it comes to the first set of witnesses, why are they liable? What they are not testifying to should be inconsequential because Hakayim Mashniya, because isn't there a second set of witnesses that are around? Obviously, we ignore those witnesses, as Rashi explains. Hakayim Mashniya, the second set of witnesses, is around, and yet we're still saying that that first set of witnesses, their denial of knowing testimony, is considered consequential enough that they're chayiv in terms of Shevuos HaEdos. Elalav Shmamina, don't we see from here, Kfiras Mammon, that when there's a denial of a monetary obligation, the Gemara here is comparing a denial of a monetary obligation to a denial of knowing testimony. In a case, let's say, that might involve a monetary obligation, we see that Kfiras Mammon, Sheyesh Olav Edom, when a person denies a monetary obligation and there are witnesses, have a kfir that is considered a substantial denial, and so therefore that would be a proof against Rabbah. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Ravina, Ravina says, Hacha b'may askin, and here what are we dealing with? Kagon shahaisa shniya b'shas kfiras harishona krovin b'nishosein. The case over here is that at the time that the first set of witnesses were denying that they knew testimony, so the second set of witnesses actually were not kosher to testify, because at that time they were related through their wives, unishosein gosos. Now you might say if they're related through their wives, it's no chiddush at all, but the reason why it's a chiddush is because their wives were gosos, which means essentially they were about to die, and so therefore they were no longer going to be related. Ma'od the chiddush is, what might you have said? Rov gosos and lamisa, that in the majority of cases gosos are going to die, and therefore we should not count it as if they're related. Kamash malan, and so that's what the Mishnah is teaching. Hashta mios chayin, who right now they are alive, they haven't died, and so therefore we don't count the fact that there's a second set of witnesses around. That's why the first set of witnesses are actually chayiv in that case. And Rashi explains, Krovin ben Ishosein, they're related through their wives, meaning Nesue Shtei Achoyos, they're married to two sisters. So at that time they're not fit to testify because they're related. V'yim Tomer, so if you're going to ask, Lamali Lamisna, what do we need to teach such a case? It isn't necessary. Kagon Shayu Gosos Bo. So again, they were Gosos at that time. Mao Detema Kaimal and Rov Gosos Lamisa. What might you have said? Rov Gosos, the majority of Gosos are going to die. V'havalahu Kamesos, maybe we consider them like they already died. V'havalei Mammon Sheyesh Olavedim, in which case it is a situation where there are other witnesses around to testify. The Lotus Chayav Rishona, maybe the first set of witnesses should not be obligated. Kamash Malon, that's what it's teaching us. Hashta Mia Lo Shachivi. Right now they have not yet died. Ve'afagav derov Gosin Lamisa. Even though most Gosin do die, Kozman Shalomes Chayhu L'chol Dvarim. As long as the Gosis has not died, he's considered to be alive for all issues. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof from the following Braisa. Balabayis Shatoan Tainas Ganav B'Pikadon. Let's say you have a Balabayis and he makes a claim of Ganav. He was watching over a Pikadon and he claims that it was stolen from him. Let's say he's a Shomer Chinam, so that would have gotten him out of any obligation. He's not Chayav on Geneva. V'nishba V'hoded. So then he takes an oath and then he admits that actually it's not true. It was not really stolen. So the halacha is by Toin Tainas Ganav in general, we treat the person who was Toin Tainas Ganav as if he was a Ganav and he has to pay kefel. But the Bryce here says uvo edim, so again he admits, but then witnesses come. So im ad shelo bo edim hoda. Now, if he admitted before the witnesses come, so in such a situation his admission actually gets him out of paying kefel, the double payment. So now he ends up having the regular halachas of Shevuos HaPikadon. Mishalim keren v'chomesh v'yasham. He pays the principal and he adds a fifth and he brings that karban asham. Now im mishabo edim hoda. Now let's say he admitted after the witnesses came, so he was already obligated to pay the fine of the double payment. The admission didn't get him out of that. So then mishalim tashlumei kefel v'yashim. So then instead of paying a chomesh, instead he pays tashlumei kefel. He pays a double payment and he brings the karban asham. And the point over here is that clearly we see from this brisa that even though there were witnesses that knew about the obligation, still the person is obligated in terms of Shevuos HaPikadon. That goes against what Rabbah said. And the Gemara answers, Hachanami, here also we can answer like we just said above, Kid Ravina, that it's like Ravina, meaning at the time that the person was denying, so then they were related. The witnesses were related to one another. And the idea is that they were related through their wives. Again, their wives were gosasos, their wives were going to die, but nonetheless, at that time they were related and they couldn't be witnesses, and that's why it is in fact a case of obligation in terms of Shevuos HaPikadon. And Rashi explains, Tainas Ganav, he makes a claim of Ganav that it was stolen from him. Patar Atzmo Al Yedei Geneva, he exempts himself through this claim of Geneva. Shetan, that he claims, Nignav Hemeni, was stolen from me. The Shomer Chinam, Patar Mi Geneva, and the Shomer Chinam is exempt, let's say it gets stolen from him, and so therefore by making this claim, he's exempting himself. The Kaimalon Baba Kaman, we've established in Baba Kama, Shim Nishba Uvo Edim, that if he takes the oath and then witnesses come, Mishal and Kefil, he actually has to pay the double payment, Kaganav Atzmo, like the God of himself. Avolim Hoda Acharkach, but if he admits after, Ein Kan Kefil, then there is no Kefil. The Moda Biknas Potter, because when one admits by a fine, so then he's Potter, and the Kefil payment is a fine. Avol Chomesh V'Yosham Yesh Mishum Shevuos HaPikadon, but he would pay the fifth and bring a Karban Osham, that's part of Shevuos HaPikadon. Again, Mishalim Tashlum Kefil Mishum Edim, if there are witnesses, he pays the Kefil because of the witnesses. V'Yosham Mishum Shvu, and because of the oath, that's why you bring the Karban Osham. Avol Chomesh Lo Mishalim, but he does not pay the Chomesh. V'Yalfin Lava Baba Kama, that's learned out from Baba Kama. Mehai Krav Shilam Oso Barosho V'Chamishi, so Yosef Olive, it says Barosho you pay the fifth. Means to say Mammon HaMishtalim Barosh, meaning the money that's paid Barosh, meaning the principal, Mosef Chomesh, on a principal you add a fifth. V'Sheino Mishtalim Barosh, but if it's not Mishtalim Barosh, Kagon Zeshi Yishalim Olav Kefil, here he's already paying the double payment, Ein Mosef Chomesh, so then we do not add the fifth. And then the Gemara answered, Kid Ravina, you answer the same answer of Ravina, Shayu Edim Krovim bin Shosein B'Shas Shvu, at the time of the oath, the witnesses were not really witnesses because they were related through their wives. Lafika Chayev Karban Command Lesnu. That's why he's obligated to bring a Karban as if there were no witnesses. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Ravina le Ravashi. Ravina said to Ravashi, Tashma, come and hear a proof from the following brisa. This brisa was quoted on the previous Amud. Chamura mimena Shevuos HaPikadon. It says that Shevuos HaPikadon is stricter than Shevuos HaEdos. Shachayavin al Zedona Makos ve'al Shigagasa Asham Bekesef Shkolim. Because they're obligated, let's say it's done on purpose, the punishment is going to be Malkus, and if it's done by mistake, so then they bring the Karban Asham that's worth at least 2 shekel. And so now the proof is as follows. Midakamar Loka, from the fact that this brisa says there's Malkus, Mechlal di'ika edim, that implies that there are witnesses. You're only going to get malchus if there are witnesses. The kamar al shigagasa asham bekasef shkolim, and then it says that if it's b'shogeg, so then you bring the karban asham, and so that seems to be against what Rabbah says, because even in a denial where there are witnesses, apparently there is an obligation to bring the karban asham. Amar lehu Rav Mordechai said to them, bar minah dahi, this brisa is really an exception because you're really learning the brisa wrong. To Amar lehu Rav Kahana, because Rav Kahana said to them, and this was also quoted on the previous Amud, I taught that brisa of Achi Taninola, and here's the proper way it should be taught. Echad Zidona v'Echad Shigagasa, both in a situation of Mazid and Shogeg, Asham Bekesef Shkalim, what is brought is a Karban Asham, and therefore if you learn it like that, there's not necessarily witnesses, because it doesn't actually mention anything about Malchus. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof this brisa also that we're about to quote was mentioned on the previous Amud. Lo imamrid ben Nazir Tameh Shekain Loka, Tomer B'Shvuos HaPikadon She'eno Loka, the brisa makes a contrast. By the Nazir Tameh, there's Malchus, whereas by Shevuos HaPikadon, there is no Malchus. Now, Hechidami, what exactly is the case in this brisa? Idaleka Edim, if we're talking about with no witnesses, so Amai Loka, why would there ever be Malchus? It's saying over here that there are Malchus by the Nazir Tameh, and there's no Malchus by Shevuos HaPikadon. That implies we're talking where there are witnesses. Elapshita Di'ika Edim, rather it's obvious that there are witnesses. The Katani, what does it say? It says in this brisa, Tomer V'Shvuos HaPikadon She'eno Loka. It says, when it comes to Shevuos HaPikadon, there's no Malchus. The implication is Milka Hudalo Lucky. The implication is there's no Malchus, Aval Karban Maisi, but there is a Karban even though there are witnesses. And so therefore, again, it would seem to be Tiyuvta de Rabbah. It seems to be a refutation of Rabbah, because Rabbah would say you're exempt since the denial is considered inconsequential when there are witnesses. And the Gemara says, indeed, Tiyuvta, indeed, this brisa is a refutation of what Rabbah said. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Hakover b'mamon sheyesh olav edim chayiv. If a person denies money, denies a monetary obligation, and there are witnesses, the person is obligated. Rabbi Yochanan here is not going like what Rabbi said before. He's saying that denial is considered consequential even though there are witnesses. However, bishtar, if the person denies it and there's a document already saying he's obligated, so they're potter. There he's actually exempt. The Gemara says, Amar Papa says, my time to Rabbi Yochanan. What's the reason of Rabbi Yochanan? Why is it that there's a difference between edim and shtar? Fundamentally, they seem the same. The denial should either be inconsequential in both cases, or it should be consequential in both cases. And so Papa explains, edim avidi demaisi. Edim, they might die, and therefore we don't count them. But shtar hamonach, but the shtar that's right in front of us, and so therefore that already makes the denial inconsequential. Gemara says, Amar le Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua le Rav Papa. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, said to Rav Papa, shtar nami, when it comes to a document also, of a demirkas, isn't it possible that that's going to get lost? Why is that any less likely than the witness is dying? So Elam Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua, rather Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, said, Hainu taimi de Rav Yochanan. This is really the reason of Rav Yochanan, mishum dehave shtar shibud karkos, because the shtar is considered a lien on land. When a person has a shtar, they can collect from land. There's a lien on the property. Ve'in mevi'in carbon, and a carbon is not brought al kfiras shibud karkos, when there's a denial that involves a shibud karkos. And Rashi explains, Mishum dahavale hai shtar mamun shakarkos mishubodim lo, because again, this shtar mamun is something where there's a lien on property, on land. Vahakoverbo, therefore somebody who denies it, kikover bekarkos, it's like he's denying land. V'kaim alon lekaman, and we established later on, de'ein nishboin ala karkos, there are no oaths, there's no shvua when it comes to land. Hilgach, therefore, says Rashi, ki yishtar banami, even if he does take an oath, ein lo din chiyuv shvua, there is no law that follows from the obligation of the shvua, meaning carbon, there is no halacha of bringing a carbon in this case. And the Gemara continues, Itmar, it was stated the following machlokas amoroim, mashbia edei karka, let's say in a case of Shevuos ha'edus, again a situation where witnesses deny that they know testimony in a particular case, and they're falsely denying that, and they take an oath. And so what if we have a situation where it involves witnesses in a case of land? This would be similar to the discussion above with shtar shibud karkos, where we said when it comes to Shevuos ha'pikadon, there is no obligation to bring a carbon by Shevuos ha'pikadon in a case where there's shibud karkos. So again, by Shevuos Edus, are they going to be exempt, or are they going to be obligated in a situation if it involves land? And so the Gemara says, Pligi Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar, there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar. Chad Amar Chayiv, one says there is an obligation in terms of Shevuos Edus, V'chad Amar Pater, and the other one says Pater, the other one says exempt. And the Gemara says, Testayim, let us conclude Rabbi Yochanan the Amar Pater, that it's Rabbi Yochanan who says exempt. Mida Amar Rabbi Yochanan hakofer b'mamon sheyesh alav edim chayiv shtar Pater, from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan said if the person by Shevuos ha'pikadon denies money where there are witnesses, he's obligated. But if there is a shtar, he's exempt. Uchid Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua, and like Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua said, that the whole reason is because of shibud karkos. In other words, by Shevuos ha'pikadon, the reason why there's no obligation is because it's related to land. And so the same thing should be true when it comes to Shevuos ha'edus. In a situation where they deny testimony by mashbia edei karka, again, Rabbi Yochanan is going to be the one also who says exempt, and the Gemara says testaim. The Gemara says indeed, you can conclude that is the case. And Rashi explains, Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua, this would follow the explanation of Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua, the parish time at Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Dein Chayav Al Kfira Shibud Karkos, because he explained the reason of Rabbi Yochanan that there is no obligation when the denial involves Shibud Karkos. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Avo. Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Avo, Lema Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar. Let us suggest that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar, again, they're arguing over here by mashbia edei karka, whether we say there's an exemption or whether there's an obligation in terms of Shevuos ha'edus. Let us say that machlokas is the same, but plugsa de Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbanan. It's the same machlokas we find by Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan. Now, the machlokas that we're about to quote between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan is really just in general about stealing land, whether that's considered to be as a regular case of stealing or not. Kamiflagi, that's what they are arguing about as well. Tetanan, because we learned in a Mishnah, Hagozel Sadam Echaver, let's say a person steals a field from his friend, V'shat Fanar, and then the river sweeps through the field and essentially damages the entire field. So the question over here is, do we say it's like stealing, for example, a movable object, in which case if the movable object gets destroyed, so then you owe money? Or do we say, no, land really can't be stolen because it doesn't move, and therefore you just return the land as is? So again, again, that's machlokas here between Tanoim. Chayiv lahamid lo sadeh divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says it's like stealing anything else, and therefore he's going to have to give him a good field. The Chachamim omer, but the Chachamim say omer lo harei shalcha lefanecha. He could just say to him harei shalcha lefanecha, just take what is yours. Rashi explains chayiv lahamid lo sadeh the kasavar karka nigzelis. Rabbi Eliezer holds that land can be stolen. The kaimul lo bereshus gazlan, so therefore now enters the possession of the thief. The korinon bei v'heshav esagzela. We have to use the rule of v'heshav esagzela. He's got to return him a new field. But the other opinion of the Chachamim is harei shalcha lefanecha. Just say this is yours before you. Kasavar karka eina nigzelis holds that land is not stolen. V'chishat fanar bereshusei demora kama hi kaima. And therefore, when the river sweeps it away, it happened in the rishus of the original owner, and therefore you just say harei shalcha lefanecha. And the Gemara now is going to go on and explain what exactly is the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon. V'amrinon b'maikam iflagi, and we sat on that Mishnah. What are they arguing about? Rabbi Eliezer dorish ribuye umiyute, v'Rabbanon darshi klali uprati. Rabbi Eliezer, he darshans in the fashion of what's called ribuy and miyut, which means inclusions and exclusions, and the Rabbanon, they darshan klal uprat. Klal means like a generalization, and prat means something that is specific. And the Gemara explains, Rabbi Eliezer dorish ribuye umiyute. Rabbi Eliezer darshans ribuye umiyute, and we're going to now quote the psukim that really are about Shevuos HaPikadon, because that's where this idea of stealing is mentioned. It says v'kichesh ba'amiso. It says he denies it. That's riba. That's an inclusion. But Pikadono b'sasum asiyad. Then it says specifically he's denying a deposit or a loan. So miyet, that's an exclusion. O mikol asher yishava. Then it says anything that he takes an oath about. Chazav riba. That's again an inclusion. Riba umiyet v'riba. When you have an inclusion exclusion followed by an inclusion riba hakol, you're really including everything. My riba kol mili. What are we including? We're including all cases of stealing. Umay miyet, and what is being excluded? Miyet shtaros. The only thing that's excluded, you're going to exclude just one case, and we're going to exclude documents. And Rashi explains miyet shtaros. You exclude shtaros. She'ein gufan mamon. Those don't even have intrinsic value. She'ein anela l'raya shebehen. They're just there for the raya. They're just there for the evidence. And the Gemara continues, V'Rabbanan darshi klalu prati. The Rabbanan, they darshan in the fashion of klalu prat. V'kichesh ba'amiso klal. V'kichesh ba'amiso is a generalization. But b'kadono b'sasum es yaro b'gazel prat. When it says deposit or a loan or something stolen, that's a specific. O mikol asher yishav ha'alav, for anything he takes the oath upon. Chazer klal, that's another generalization. Klalu pratu klal yatadon elakain ha'prat. When it comes to klalu pratu klal, we include anything that's similar to what was specified. Mahaprat meforish, davar hametaltal v'gufo mamon, just like what was specified are movable objects that have intrinsic value. Afkol davar hametaltal v'gufo mamon, so too we include anything that's movable that has intrinsic value. Yotzu karkos she'in metaltal, that excludes land which is not movable. Yotzu avodim shokshu lekarkos, that excludes slaves which are compared to land. And yotzu shtaros, that excludes documents she'afal bisha metaltal, and even though they're movable, ein gufon mamon, they do not have intrinsic value. And so the Gemara now suggests, man de mechayev, the one that says chayev, meaning by mashbia edei karka, in terms of the situation of Shevuos HaEdus, whether there's an obligation, the one that says chayiv, ki Rabbi Eliezer is following Rabbi Eliezer, that land is included in these psukim and it can be stolen, and therefore again, there's going to be an obligation in terms of Shevuos HaEdus. Uman de Potter, and the one that says exempt ki Rabbanan, follows the Rabbanan and says that land is not included, and so therefore there's no obligation in terms of Shevuos HaEdus as well. Rashi explains, man de mechayev alayu din karban shvua, the one who says obligated in terms of karban shvua, Rabbi Eliezer follows Rabbi Eliezer. Kihechi demar beluhu le'inyan hashava, just like Rabbi Eliezer includes land in terms of the halacha of hashava, of returning the land. Let's say it gets swept away by a river. Mar beluhu nami l'chol amar binyan, so it includes also anything that's included in that whole topic, meaning to say including as well the carbon. The carbon bahi in yonaksiv, and the carbon is written in that topic, and so therefore that's why that is included. But the Gemara continues and says, Amar Lei said back to him, Lo, no, it's not really true that the Machlokas Amoraim exactly follows the Machlokas Tanoim. Man de Mechayev, now the one who says Chayev in terms of the Karban Asham, when it comes to Mashbiei de Karka, that actually is Rabbi Eliezer. That actually would have to follow Rabbi Eliezer, because again, if you're saying that you're Chayev in terms of Karban, you're also saying that the land can be stolen. However, Uman de Potter, the one who says exempt in terms of the Karban, Amar Lach, he will say to you, Baha, that in this situation, situation, afilu Rabbi Eliezer mode, even Rabbi Eliezer would admit, meaning even Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the land can be stolen, might not go so far as to say that a carbon is obligated. And why is that? Rachmana Amar Mikol, because the pasuk says Mikol velo Hakol. It says from all, but it doesn't say all. As Rashi explains, afilu Rabbi Eliezer mode, even Rabbi Eliezer would admit, diafagav disrabu binyan hashava, even though land is included in terms of hashava, lo israbu linyan chomesh v'asham, not necessarily is it included in terms of the 1/5 and in terms of the carbon asham. Techiyahader krov v'nokat inyan chomesh v'asham, because when the pasuk goes ahead and talks about chomesh v'asham, ksiv, what is written over there? It says, O mikol asher yishava olav l'sheker v'chamishiso Yosef olav es hashamo yavi mikol v'lo hakol, from all but not all, meaning there are some things excluded. Ve'imit luhu davar she'eno dome leprat, and therefore something that's not similar to the prat is going to be excluded. In other words, there's an extra exclusion when it comes to the chomesh and the asham, and so therefore even if somebody were to hold, let's say that land could be stolen, but nevertheless it could be there's an exemption in terms of the halacha of Shevuos HaPikadon and Shevuos HaEdus. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Papa Mishmei de Rava. Rav Papa says in the name of Rava, Masnisa Nami Daika. You can also infer this from our Mishnah. To Katani, because what does it say in our Mishnah? Again, our Mishnah is talking about Shevuos HaPikadon. It says, Ganafta es Shori. A case of Shevuos HaPikadon could be as follows. Let's say he says to him, you stole my axe. V'hu Omer lo Ganafti, he says, I didn't steal it. Then Mashbiachani, he says, I'm going to give you an oath. Take an oath that you didn't steal it. V'yamar Amen, and then the person says Amen. So Chayiv, so in that situation he's going to be Chayiv, again in terms of the Karban Shvuah. So the proof over here from the Mishnah is as follows. It specifically gives a situation of stealing an ox. It does not say, you stole my slave. Why is it that we're specifically choosing a case of an ox and not a slave? My time, and what's the reason? Lav mishum, is it not because the eved iskish lekarkos, a slave is compared to land as we just said above, and so therefore essentially that's a case of land. Ve'ein mevian karban al kfiras shibat karkos, and therefore the Mishnah is saying that a carbon shvuah is not brought when it comes to a denial that involves Shibut Karkos, as Rashi explains, Masisa Nami Daika, Ki Rabbi Yochanan, the Mishnah seems to go like Rabbi Yochanan, the Einechi of Karban Shvuah, Bekarkos. There is no Karban Shvuah when it comes to Karka, when it comes to land. But the Gemara continues and says, Amar Rav Papi, Mishmei de Rava. Rav Papi, in the name of Rava, says, Ema Seifa. You're bringing a proof from that part of the Mishnah, but look at the end of the Mishnah. At the end of the Mishnah, what does it say? It says, Zeh HaKlal, this is the rule. Kol HaMeshalim Al Piatzmo Chayiv. Anytime the person pays on his own, meaning anytime it's not a fine, the person would pay even by admission. So then chayiv, then there's an obligation in terms of this carbon shvuah. V'sheinu mishalim al piatzmo, but if he doesn't pay al piatzmo, meaning if it's a situation of a knas, a fine, where if he would admit he would be potter, so then he's exempt also in terms of carbon shvuah. Now, generally speaking, when it says zeh haklal, that's usually an inclusion. So zeh haklal leisuye mai. So if it says zeh haklal over here, what is that coming to include? Lav leisuye gonaftas avdi. Isn't that coming to include exactly the case we just discussed above, a case where the person says, you stole my slave, and that would have the exact opposite implication. There we would be saying that in such a situation there would be an obligation to carbon shvuah, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph.